Welcome to Quips and Clips, everyone. President Donald Trump on Tuesday, March 25th, signed an executive order that seeks to require documentary proof of citizenship when registering to vote. Now, he's kind of coming late to this party, as Congress has been trying to pass similar legislation since last Congress, and it's expected to come up again in this one. I sat down with Campaign Legal Center's Director of Voting Rights, Brent Ferguson, about a week and a half before this EO was signed. Brent Ferguson, thank you for joining me.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about the assault on voting rights. I know that new tactics for disturbing or destroying voting rights include gerrymandering districts, restricting access with short hours, or creating like at-large districts that have long lines and of course, purging voter rolls of people accused of being ineligible to vote. You're heavily involved in the latter, and a case out of Virginia where the Supreme Court upheld the state's roll purge less than 2 weeks before the election. Tell us about the Beals case.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So in Virginia, like every state, only U.S. citizens are allowed to vote. And in Virginia, like every other state in the country, it's illegal for non-U.S. citizens to vote, and that barely ever happens. But about 90 days before last fall's election, the governor of Virginia issued an order requiring a voter purge. And essentially what a voter purge is looking at existing lists of registered voters and kicking some off the rolls. And of course, that should be done in a thoughtful way that finds people who are mistakenly registered or have some problem with their registration. But the problem here is that executive order from the governor purged a lot of U.S. citizens on the faulty assumption that they were non-citizens. And that's because the state of Virginia was getting data from its DMV. And what happens in Virginia and a lot of other states is that people who are legal permanent residents get a driver's license. The data shows that they're not a U.S. citizen. Later, they get their citizenship and register to vote. And because there's no requirement to update the data with the DMV, it still shows that they're not a U.S. citizen. And so instead of looking into each case individually or something like that, the state of Virginia simply purged thousands of voters. They did this largely in secret because they didn't produce the list of voters they were going to purge. And so we at Campaign Legal Center filed a lawsuit because not only is that the wrong thing to do, it violates the National Voter Registration Act, which has a lot of protections for voters across the country. And one of those protections says that states are not allowed to purge their voter rolls on a systematic basis within 90 days before the election. That's what happened here. As you mentioned, the lower court in that case said that Virginia's actions were illegal, and then the Supreme Court put a stay on that holding.
So do you know when the actual hearing is going to be to decide it ultimately for the final decision?
Sure. Eventually, there will likely be a trial, and we don't have a date for that yet. We'd like to move quickly because we want to get this resolved. The state has moved to dismiss the case completely, which we've, of course, opposed, and we're waiting on a decision there. We're confident that the case will proceed, and we hope to go to trial sometime later this year.
Was there any actual evidence at all of non-citizens voting in this case for Virginia?
Not that we've seen. And what we have seen is evidence that U.S. citizens have been kicked off the rolls. And that's because once this list became made public and once the media started reporting on it, we started hearing reports of people who were U.S. citizens who were kicked off the rolls and received a notice. And that happens for a lot of different reasons. I mean, mainly the one that I mentioned is that the state's relying on old data and not doing enough to make sure they have updated data. But we also have heard stories from people who were born in the United States. So they were never a non-U.S. citizen and they received these notices too. And so there's a lot to be answered here. We've started to get information from the state, and we did that last October and November in the early stages of this case. But certainly a focus over the spring and summer will be uncovering what exactly happened here, what the state is doing behind the scenes.
Some of those are about felons, correct? Felons that were on the rolls and then had their voting rights
Was there a question of whether their voting rights were restored or something to that effect?
So certainly that issue comes up a lot in various states. That hasn't been a central issue here in this case because it's largely about the citizenship.
Okay.
But we certainly see states that make it confusing, difficult for people to get back on the rolls, even when they're legally eligible once they've completed a sentence.
How many cases like Beals are happening around the country right now? Do you know?
So there is one case that's quite similar out of Alabama, and the facts that I described about Virginia largely apply to Alabama too. Alabama instituted a system of voter purges shortly before the election, relying on data from that state's DMV and the Department of Labor. And once Campaign Legal Center filed suit on behalf of our clients and got some more data about that, it showed that almost all of the people, in fact, were citizens, and it was just faulty data. So those are the two main ones involving this specific purge just before this election. But certainly across the country, we've seen instances and cases of states trying to apply some kind of citizenship, documentary proof of citizenship rule, or some kind of purge that almost inevitably ends up affecting voters and kicking people off the rolls even when they're eligible to vote.
Sure. All right. So relatedly, Congress is trying to force proof of citizenship in person when registering to vote. Democrat opponents say the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility, or the SAVE Act, would disenfranchise millions of people. They say that proof of citizenship is burdensome. And do you agree?
Certainly, yes, in the way that it's required in the SAVE Act. So we can talk about that a little bit. And I want to say at the outset that, like I said at the beginning, citizenship is required in every state to vote. It's illegal to vote as a non-U.S. citizen in statewide and federal elections, and people who do it are prosecuted. That happens on a vanishingly rare basis.
It's something like 1 in a million, isn't it?
Something like that. And when people register, they affirm under penalty of perjury that they are a U.S. citizen. So there's just no reason for someone to risk their legal status in the United States or to risk going to prison to cast a single vote. The problem with the proof of citizenship laws that exist now, like the one in Arizona and what would be required in the SAVE Act, is that it goes after a problem that really is non-existent, and it creates a huge burden that would, in fact, disenfranchise millions of people. And that's because it allows a limited number of documents that people can use to prove their citizenship. And there are actually quite a high number of people in the US that can't provide those documents. I mean, one thing that the SAVE Act relies on is passports, and only about half of US citizens even have a passport. People can also use a birth certificate, but a lot of people don't have a birth certificate or don't have easy access to it. And it also requires that someone have the same name that is shown on their birth certificate. So that affects anyone who's changed their name since they were born, which a lot of married people have and a lot of other people have. So this law, there's a long list of reasons that this law creates burdens and would make it harder to vote. And I'll just say, before we go on, there are other groups of people who might be able to produce this documentation, but would have a harder time. And so that includes rural voters, people who live far from a voting registration site, and they might have to drive hours to bring their documentation in person. That includes elderly voters and very younger voters, and oftentimes Hispanic voters who don't have as easy access to their citizenship documentation.
Okay. It looked like there's a provision in the law, though, that requires the states to create some kind of loophole. I mean, some alternate way other than a birth certificate. Does that not solve the problem or no?
So I wouldn't call it a loophole, but what it does, I think, sensibly is that it allows some process for people who do not have proof of citizenship to get registered. And the fact that that exists is good. The problem is that that will be up to each state how to actually apply it and how burdensome it will be. So, of course, just going through the process of essentially what it would require is people who don't have proof of citizenship going to affirm to a state official that they are a citizen and trying to provide some kind of proof, even if it's not on the general list of what's required. We're very concerned that if this passes in a lot of states, it will essentially be not a form that can really be used because states will be so strict, and that, very well likely might be the same kind of states that are purging people right now. That's something certainly that we would like to see improved in the SAVE Act. Of course, it would be better if it just doesn't pass at all. But if it were to pass, we'd be looking very closely to try to make sure that states are implementing it in a way that gives people that option.
Okay. Do you think that there are 7 Democrats in the Senate that are willing to pass this thing?
I want to make a political prediction, but what the important thing is to make sure that everyone in the Senate and the House is aware of what this would actually do. I think the SAVE Act passed in the House in the last Congress. It's been in the news a bit in the past couple of months. And one troubling thing is, I think when it was initially discussed, is people seem to think it's just a voter ID law. A few states already have voter ID laws, but this is very different. This would end mail registration because it would require proof of citizenship in person. It would threaten online registration because it's unclear whether a fully online registration is allowed under the act. And so that type of burden and the way that it would change registration for Americans all across the country is really fundamental. And that's the important thing to understand about the SAVE Act.
Gotcha. Do you disagree with at least presenting an ID? Do you disagree with the states that do require some kind of ID at the voting booth?
So most states that have done that in, again, a burdensome way that we think is not. Basically, it's applied in a way that makes it very difficult for some people to cast a ballot. The issue of providing some kind of ID at some point in the process doesn't always have to be burdensome. But when you have a narrow list of IDs and when it has to be a certain one with a photo that not everyone has easy access to, that creates a problem. But I do want to make clear again that certainly, while it creates some burden, and that burden varies based on the state, the SAVE Act is nationwide, and it's a much higher requirement for all voters. And that's not only when they register in the first place, it's when they move. And so they have to re-register. So we're talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions of instances of where people have to find this kind of documentation and take it in person. And that's just a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. Are you guys having a hard time getting this particular message out, given the fact that, every time Gallup does a poll on this, the numbers are huge in favor of voter ID. So how do you guys combat?
So I think that is true with regard to voter ID. I have not seen numbers like that with regard to proof of citizenship. And so I think that's an important thing that we focus on. And that's what we've done in the past month or so when we've released explainers and things like that to try to go step by step about exactly what the SAVE Act would do. And I think there's a difference between just hearing a simple question about whether voter ID is a good idea and learning about the burdens, for example, that the SAVE Act would require and how many people would run into real problems if it were passed.
Okay. Obviously, another election practice that Democrats uniformly oppose is the gerrymandering. Supreme Court recently struck down Alabama's efforts, which came as a surprise to a lot of people. But that was a challenge brought under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 65. And that provision, of course, allows people to sue the state for voting practices that are believed to be discriminatory. Do you think this section will survive this administration?
I very much hope so. I want to go back for a second and just say the problem of gerrymandering and discriminatory redistricting is a problem from all sides of the political aisle, and Democrats have a long history of doing it just as Republicans, and basically people in power often gerrymander to try to keep their party in power, and oftentimes to keep minority groups from gaining power that those groups deserve and want to gain. So with regard to the Voting Rights Act and Section 2, certainly since it was passed decades ago, it has been narrowed by the courts and by governments that try to avoid it. I think you're right that the case out of Alabama decided a couple of years ago was a threat to Section 2, and we're very glad that it is surviving. I think what the message the Supreme Court gave in that case is that Section 2 is still alive and well, and states have an obligation to redistrict in a manner that does not dilute the vote of any group. And so in Alabama, you see that that requires districts that reflect the population of the state. And so we think that coming up on this next redistricting cycle, regardless of what this administration thinks about Section 2, that will be the law. I find it highly unlikely and hard to believe that Congress would go back now and eliminate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. If they did, it would be a travesty for the country, and it would create a big problem for our democracy moving forward.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the last revision to Section 2 is 82, right? Is there any kind of lobbying or suggestion that it could be further refined and in a way to save it right now?
Sure. So there are proposals in Congress to improve the Voting Rights Act, and that we largely see that in the John Lewis Act, which has been introduced and it's been around for a few years. And so I want to make sure to distinguish between Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which both are really fundamental parts of that law. Section 2 that we've been talking about, in its simplest terms, it requires that when states draw districts or when localities draw districts, they do so in a way that's fair and gives all voting groups their fair share of the power. Now, Section 5 is different, and what it does is say, for a certain group of states that have a long history of voting discrimination, they have to get their new voting laws pre-cleared with a court or the federal government before they're allowed to implement them. So that was an especially important part of the Voting Rights Act in the 70s, when a lot of states that were covered were trying to pass discriminatory laws. That part of the law was invalidated a little over 10 years ago by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County case. So when we're talking about reforming the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Act would improve on both of those sections. And so it would reinstitute that pre-clearance program by saying that there's a new formula for how to decide which states have to get their laws pre-cleared, and that has to do with their recent history of violating the law. And then the new Section 2 would essentially strengthen the protections for minority voters who want to say, hey, we live in an area where we have a decent number of people that should be able to band together and elect their representative choice. We can't do that now. And so that law would really fundamentally change things now because the Voting Rights Act has been so weakened.
Gotcha. So is there any effort right now to lobby, because of course it would require lobbying Republicans to get this passed? Is there any effort right now to see if you can pull a few, Murkowskis and et cetera?
So I'm sure there is some kind of effort. I want to be real, is that because this Congress is focused on things like the SAVE Act, and that's an anti-voter law that would make things more difficult and unfair. And I just think it's highly unlikely to persuade enough people in this Congress to pass it, especially given the Senate filibuster and everything. That happens with all sorts of laws that end up being transformative, and it takes them a while to be passed. So that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be talking about why this is necessary and still pushing for it. It just seems unlikely in the next couple of years. But one thing that we can do and we are doing is promoting state voting rights acts. And so that is basically different versions of the John Lewis Act that I was talking about that really improve fairness of elections in specific states. And this is important because even in states that we think of as friendly to voting rights, there are localities and counties that often have discriminatory systems or systems with the kind of at-large districts that you mentioned, where there are relatively large groups of Hispanic or Black or Asian voters that can never elect a candidate of choice simply because they get outvoted by a majority of white voters. And so I believe now there are 7 states that have passed state voting rights acts, and it's on the table and a few more. And so that's really, and that includes big states like California. And so that's tens of millions of people who are using these newer, updated versions of voting rights acts and have fair election systems as a result.
So even if the court leaves Section 2 alone, the Justice Department right now has kind of ceased to pursue these cases. So are organizations like yours kind of picking up the baton where the Justice Department is dropping it?
We're certainly trying to, and we can go back to the Virginia case we were talking about before. So this is an example of the Department of Justice being involved in enforcement of federal law and then backing out under the new administration, which creates a big problem. So you mentioned this case came about last October when the voter purge was happening. We at CLC sued on behalf of our clients, and the Department of Justice separately sued under the National Voter Registration Act. That case was consolidated. And so there, DOJ argued, just like we did, that the state was not allowed to do a systematic purge of its voter rolls just before the election. Now, about 6 weeks ago, DOJ voluntarily dismissed that case. And so we are continuing the case, and so it'll still be pursued. But it just represents a big problem if our federal government is unwilling to enforce federal laws that make our elections safe. So we can't predict exactly how that will affect voting rights and enforcement going forward over the next few years, but certainly it will weaken that enforcement. And I just want to tie this back into Section 2 of the VRA that you mentioned. One prevailing argument right now is that Section 2 cannot be enforced by private litigants.
Right.
And so
Right.
for decades, private litigants have enforced Section 2 and successfully done so, including in the Supreme Court. But there's a new push to prevent that and say only the federal government can do it. And of course, if we have a federal government that's unwilling to do it, and courts hold that private citizens aren't allowed to, then that is at least temporarily the end of Section 2.
Right. What happens then? What would the voters' recourse be then? They're just stuck with not being able to vote or discriminatory.
So the main recourse would be to try to update Section 2 in Congress. And so this would be a narrower improvement of Section 2 than what we're talking about in the John Lewis Act. But certainly Congress could go back in and say, hey, look, what we meant to do is provide a private right of action for citizens to sue. In that, we already know that that's what they intended to do when this law was passed, but making that very clear would solve the problem.
So what can the general public do to try to keep the SAVE Act from being passed and keep Section 2 the way it is, et cetera, et cetera? What's your recommendation?
There are a lot of things the public can do. I mean, the first thing is call your members of Congress. And so the SAVE Act is likely going to be up for a vote sometime soon in the House. And what people can do is call their members of Congress and talk about that big burden that they don't want to be placed on them for registering. So this includes rural voters who don't want to have to drive hours before registering or re-registering. And it includes all the groups I mentioned that would face a new burden. So I think I talked a few minutes ago about how CLC has tried to publicize some of these problems, but I think hearing directly from voters and constituents is really important on that. And then beyond just the SAVE Act, I think taking part in elements of our democracy that can improve fairness and make democracy a bigger tent, essentially make it so more people can participate, is important. And so that means pushing for things like State Voting Rights Act, calling state legislators to talk about the importance of that. And then we've been talking about gerrymandering a little bit too. One thing that has been an improvement in the redistricting system in the past decade is that more states are adopting citizen-led redistricting commissions. And so that means that regular people, instead of politicians, are drawing the lines. We saw Michigan and Colorado do that for the first time this last decade in a very successful way. These are commissions that are made up of equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, and usually with some independents and non-affiliated people as well. And time again, those practices show that people can work together, pass fair maps that give everyone a voice. And so that's something that we hope expands even further across the country before the next decade. So those are a handful of things, but there's a long, long list for sure.
Real quick, I'm wondering, in hindsight, voting practices changed a great deal because of COVID. Would you say that on the whole, that it was for the better or for the worse? Because it just seems like there's been so many reactionary occurrences because of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really hard to say yes or no. I think what you're getting at is that there is a big expansion of mail voting and just systems that make it easier to register. And so that aspect of it was obviously very good. You know, in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, we saw a huge voter turnout for the presidential election. And a lot of states have kept that kind of expansion of registration options, which is really good. The problem is that we've seen some kind of backlash to that. We've seen baseless allegations that there's fraud in mail voting. We've seen this rise in false allegations that elections are controlled by non-citizens and things like that. And so I think it remains to be seen, you know, after 2020, whether the outcome is good or bad. But I think there is a foundation for us to see from the 2020 experience that we can make voting easier and more people can do it. And as long as we can correct the record and say, hey, look, the fraud that people are talking about is extremely rare. It's not affecting the fairness of our elections. And it's actually the reaction to those baseless allegations of fraud that is really creating the unfairness. If we can get to a point to where most Americans understand that fact, then I think we'll be on the road to a better system.
Great. It's a good place to end. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, very happy to be here. Thanks so much.
You bet.